All right. There's always this awkward minute or two where we're waiting for it to show up on our devices.
I know. Make sure it's actually working.
Yeah. Did you have a good weekend?
I did.
Good.
What do we do?
Yeah, I'm in Texas. I was doing a meeting with the San Marcos Church.
All right.
And, it was really good. It was
Yeah.
good to be with them.
Had you been with him before, or was this the first time?
Yeah, I was here like 3 years ago. So this was a give me another try kind of meeting. So
That was nice. Nice whenever you know people and it's a return to a relationship, not like a guy just rolling in to
right.
town and I don't know you, you don't know me, all that kind of thing.
Exactly. Hi, Karen. All right. I think maybe there's a couple people here. You ready to get going?
Let's do it.
Well, welcome everyone. We're going to be in Matthew chapter 18 today, and we're going to try to get through verses 1 through 14. We'll do kind of the first half of the chapter this time, and next time we'll try to get through the rest. But maybe just to remind everybody, the last couple of chapters of Matthew have been pretty significant. Matthew 16, Jesus had asked the question, who do people say that I am? And really the foundational idea of all of this is, if you believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, that's the confession that's going to matter, so, to everyone. And then we saw in chapter 17 where Jesus was transfigured, and really he was elevated by God, and essentially his father said, this is the one that you need to listen to. This is my king. This is your king. This is my son. And then we saw some struggles that went on with the apostles' faith, coming down the mountain and all of that. So I think we're going to see some of that idea of about people who believe and what it means to believe and what it means to have faith. Some of that's going to be covered here in chapter 18. You have anything you want to add before we read it?
No, I think that's pretty good. And maybe the negative way of saying what you just said is we're going to see some of the biggest hangups and complications with being able to grow in our faith, and some of the reasons why we don't is if we don't figure out this stuff that Jesus talks about here in Matthew 18.
Yeah, no, very good, very good. All right, let's start reading. Matthew 18:1. At that time, the disciples came to Jesus and said, who then is greatest in the kingdom of heaven? And he called a child to himself and set him before them and said, truly I say to you, unless you are converted and become like children, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. Whoever then humbles himself as this child, he is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. And whoever receives one such child in my name receives me. But whoever causes one of these little ones who believe in me to stumble, it would be better for him to have a heavy millstone hung around his neck and to be drowned in the depth of the sea. Woe to the world because of its stumbling blocks, for it is inevitable that stumbling blocks come. But woe to that man through whom the stumbling block comes. If your hand or your foot causes you to stumble, cut it off and throw it from you. It is better for you to enter life crippled or lame than to have 2 hands or 2 feet and be cast into eternal fire. If your eye causes you to stumble, pluck it out and throw it from you. It is better for you to enter life with 1 eye than to have 2 eyes and be cast into the fiery hell. See that you do not despise one of these little ones. For I say to you that their angels in heaven continually see the face of my Father who is in heaven. For the Son of Man is come to save that which was lost. What do you think? If any man has 100 sheep and one of them goes astray, does he not leave the 99 on the mountain and go and search for the one that is straying? If it turns out that he finds it, truly I say to you, he rejoices over it more than over the 99 which have not gone astray. So it is not the will of your Father who is in heaven that any of these little ones perish.
This is a weird section to me because it has some of the most tender, gentle, sweet images that Jesus ever uses. He takes a child, he talks about people like sheep that a shepherd would care for and want to chase down to protect.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then he's also talking about hell and talks in a pretty like gruesome way of killing somebody, tying a millstone around their neck and throwing them into the sea. I mean, this is
Right.
dark. Like your movie immediately becomes a PG-13 movie if you have that scene in the movie, like immediately. No cursing, no nudity. You have that, boom, it's PG-13. It's a bad thing. I'm just saying it's an interesting kind of tension and contrast almost with the way Jesus talks here. And it shows me, I think, how important we are and how important our lives are to him. Because he's saying, hey, I love you guys like children. I want to treat you like sheep. I'm here for you. But you got to realize if you mess this thing up, this is how dire and how devastating it will be if you mess each other's lives up or if you mess your life up with the Lord. It really elevates how serious it is to figure
Yeah.
out how to follow Jesus.
Yeah, absolutely. It makes me think of what Paul wrote in Romans, behold the goodness and severity of God. Um, you know, and I think this is something that we forget a lot about when it comes to Jesus being the king. And this is all kingdom talk. Hey, what's the kingdom like?
Yeah.
Who's important in the kingdom? Jesus both defines like here, well, here's who's going to be valuable in the kingdom, but here's also who I'm going to judge if they mess with my kingdom. Jesus is not to be trifled with. He's not, just our buddy or somebody's buddy. Like you said, he's a shepherd. He cares about this. But just like God illustrated throughout the Old Testament, you don't mess with God's people. And so among us in the church, we need to be really careful about how we treat one another and whether or not we cause each other to stumble. There's nothing more important than the souls of men. And Jesus is going to be very serious about that.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's because of that seriousness, and like you said, that this is all in the kingdom context, and that is the question in verse 1. The disciples came to Jesus, said, "Who then is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven?"
Mhm.
He's going to talk about that. Let's talk about people and greatness and rank. But the very very first thing you need to understand if you're going to be in this kingdom is you've got to be like a child. And sometimes we read the child thing and you think, oh, we need to be sweet or we need to be like innocent, maybe like a child is, at least babies are innocent and stuff. But Jesus specifies what he means by this here. And I think the other passages, even when he doesn't use the exact word, I think the context usually indicates what he's talking about with this. It's not about being sweet. It's not about being innocent, although that's great. We should pursue those things.
Mhm.
But it's about humility and understanding he is the king and my fellow kingdom members are my brothers and sisters, and we're all under one father who cares for us, and he has a will that should dictate the way we live our lives. We don't get to determine that ourselves, either individually or even collectively. Learning the attitude and disciplining our heart to have the attitude of humility is maybe the fundamental quality that's necessary to be in the kingdom of Jesus.
Very good. So I kind of wonder, here's the question I've got about this section with all of this. Why are they even asking this question, first of all? Like why are they wondering about who's greatest in the kingdom? Does it maybe have something to do with, the Father had just spoken on the Mount of Transfiguration. Jesus is the one to listen to over Moses and Elijah. God had just sort of illustrated, I've elevated my son here to be the one. And then, Jesus has that conversation at the end of chapter 18 or chapter 17 of like the sons being
Yeah.
free. You know what I mean? And so now these guys are thinking, oh, kingdom of heaven, like this is what this new kingdom that Jesus is going to build. And still they probably don't have all their ideas right about it. But like, okay, so who's going to be number two? Who's going to sit at your right hand? Who's going to be important here? Um, so, I wonder, like you said, his main point is the humility of a child. Like whoever humbles himself, that's going to be the person that enters the kingdom. So in verse 2, when he calls the child to himself and sets them before him, look at the humility of that. I wonder who that kid was. Like, hey kid, come here. And the kid just comes, hey kid, sit down and face these people. And the kid just does it.
Yep.
Imagine the timidity that child probably felt in this moment. Here's these adults, that wasn't a typical thing. But for like a rabbi who's well known, crowds are crowding around him to be, call this kid, and the kid just complies and comes and does what he says. You almost wonder if Jesus says, he puts this kid on display and he says, unless, verse 3, my version says, unless you are converted. But I think a lot of the versions just translate that, unless you turn.
Yeah.
Unless you turn and become like children. So what does that mean, unless you turn? I think, sometimes they translate it converted so that we can maybe try to go through like, oh, what's the conversion process? I honestly think that contextually what he's saying is, you guys have to turn from this mindset of being great in the kingdom. Like, you guys are headed the wrong way with this. I'm trying to make you leaders and apostles, and I'm trying to make you servants in my kingdom. And you guys are headed the wrong way with this conversation. You need to turn around and think differently about this. Um, that word turn is the same word that's used in like the Sermon on the Mount when he said, turn the other cheek. Or times where like literally Jesus would turn and look at somebody. Like, the idea is, you're facing the wrong direction, turn and like think more like this.
And this has kind of been one of the primary themes in Jesus' teaching that we've noticed. I mean, the Sermon on the Mount began with, blessed are the poor in spirit, those who turn away from being haughty or high-minded or self-sufficient, but have a childlike attitude. In the prayer Jesus prayed in chapter 11, come to me, all you who are weary and heavy laden. Well, right before that in Jesus' prayer, he said, Father, I thank you. You didn't give these things to the mighty, but actually to children, to infants, people not who are ignorant or anything, although we are ignorant compared to Christ and in God's sight, really. But that's not the idea. But it's having this childlike attitude that, yeah, I will sit in your lap. You can put me on display if you need to use me for display. I need you to educate me and lead me and care for me and provide for me. Like, I'm dependent on you and I'm submissive to you and I'm obedient to you and all those sorts of things. This is a humongous theme, and he's not going to stop. I mean, it's going to come up again in chapter 19, again, chapter 20. He's going to mention this sort of thing whenever he gets to his condemnation of the religious establishment. A couple people I was noticing were mentioning that this is right on the heels of the Jewish hierarchy and the poll tax and all that in chapter 17. He's going to speak ill of the religious establishment around him. And the opening paragraph of that is all about pride and people wanting to have titles and present themselves in certain ways. This is so key and so central to everything else. And especially, as he moves here, he's going to talk about two things. One is how I impact you, either positively or negatively, and even how I myself handle sin and temptation. And sometimes when I'm like, man, why do I keep on messing up other people or complicating other people's service to God? Or why do I keep on tripping up and falling into sin? Probably I have a pretty big problem with coming to him like a child and coming with this childlike spirit. This is where it starts. And those other things are manifestations of it. And if I don't get this thing right, I'm going to keep on tripping up others and tripping up myself while I'm trying to follow Jesus.
Yeah, very good. In some ways, this almost parable that he tells in verses 12 through 14 at the end of this reading that we just did, that premise kind of goes back towards the conversation. So the very last thing he says in verse 14, it is not the will of the Father who's in heaven that one of these little ones perish. Like, God does not want anyone to be lost. He doesn't want you to be lost. He doesn't want anybody around you to be lost. And if you're going to be part of my kingdom, Jesus says, you have to understand what it means for me to be a shepherd. Like, this is my creation. These are people made in my image. And if there's one that's gone astray, I'm literally going to leave heaven and come to earth and try to find them. And here's what he's warning his disciples and his apostles who are arguing about being great in the kingdom. He's like, unless you guys figure out that this is all that matters are the souls of men, you will never get this right.
Yeah.
If you don't watch what you teach, because if you teach wrong and somebody stumbles over it, woe is you for that.
Mm-hmm.
James would say later in James 3, let not many of you become teachers, because you'll incur stricter judgment. What if something we teach leads somebody down the wrong path? What if we leave something untaught that people need to know? There's all those kinds of things. Or what if just by our attitude towards people, like we act like they don't matter?
Right.
When he says there in verse 4 and 5, you have to humble yourself. Verse 5, whoever receives one such child, like he adds two things. He's like, you need to be a certain way, but then you have to make sure you receive other people who are being like this. Um, and then in verse 6, if you cause one of these little ones who believe in me to stumble, like you might as well, be taken by the mafia out to the pier, and
Yeah.
cement shoes for you. Like you've completely missed the point of all of this.
Yeah. And actually, I think verse 5 that you pointed out is really helpful because for me, I have to ask myself, okay, like the problem with the tricky part about this is if you get prideful, I don't think you usually realize it. If you don't have this humble spirit, you don't usually realize it until you really have gotten yourself in a mess, or maybe you never realize it. But this Jesus does give us a great, really tangible, practical thing to do to test our spirit and our attitude and to cultivate it. Because in verse 5, he says, whoever receives one such child in my name receives me. So if I want to receive Jesus like a child, then part of that means how do I interact with people? Do I only want to be friends with people who are going to elevate my status or make me look better or derive some kind of benefit for me? Or am I willing to receive really anybody, but especially those who are lowly and those who may be rejected or may be mistreated? I think it's Romans 12 is where that passage says that we should associate with the lowly, with the low things, And that doesn't necessarily just even mean people, but just am I a high-minded person who likes to elevate myself or make other people think I'm important or somebody big? Or am I willing to say, no, I'm not somebody big. I'm somebody small. I'm just a child in the kingdom of heaven. And that's big. That's the biggest thing. That's the greatest thing is to be a small person in God's kingdom. But that's what it's
Yeah.
all about.
Yeah. One of the questions I think that gets asked, or sometimes this text is used to discuss, is about like how young is somebody that can be a believer? What's this child stuff and a child who believes in me and all of that? And so people like I've heard people talk about, so is the rest of this text about causing a little one to stumble, just about causing children to stumble? Because the fact of the matter is, there are children who grow up and begin to believe in Jesus, and there's all kinds of things that we adults can do to shut them out or to get them off track, or because of our hypocrisy, like cause them to fall away. But there's a language change in verse 6. He stops using the word child after verse 5, and he starts using this term little ones,
Yeah.
little ones who believe in me. And then all through the rest of the text, he's going to use that. Down there in verse 10, see that you do not despise one of these little ones. Down there in verse 14, um, that one of these little ones perish. What's a little one? Is that just a child? Just for what it's worth, Jesus used that term back in Matthew 10:42 at the end of that sermon where he sent his disciples out. And he said, whoever gives a cup of cold water to one of these little ones, it literally would mean something like a humble one.
Yeah.
I don't think Jesus is talking about just little in age. I mean, kind of follow his conversation. They said, hey, who's great in the kingdom? And he says, well, who's great in the kingdom are those that are like
Right.
children
Yeah.
who are humble. And maybe this is like the practical way to talk about this. Have you ever seen somebody come to the Lord? We've seen this, right, Ben? Somebody comes to the Lord, they really need God's help. And so they finally humble themselves and come to the Lord. They don't know as much about the Bible as the people around them. They feel a little bit out of place in our churches because these people have been doing this for years. They're just sort of looking for guidance, they're looking for help, they're just looking for the Lord. um, and here they come into our place. And then if we start walking around like, hey, we're the ones that matter in this church, we're the clergy, or we're the preachers, or we're the teachers, or like he says in verse 10, despising people. That doesn't mean to hate them. The word despise just means to think nothing of them, like they're not there.
What I'm reading from right now says look down on.
Yeah, look down on. You know, how much damage has been done over the years because some humble person who's finally humbled their life comes into a community of people, and then feels looked down on or despised, or, like they don't really matter. And so Jesus is really trying to shake these guys up to say, just stop thinking about yourself. Stop it. Think about these other people around you, and figure out how to help them, and do not cause them to stumble by your attitudes towards them.
Yeah. Yeah. So verses 8 and 9 are interesting to me in this, because
Mhm.
if you just clipped out verses 8 and 9, then it would seem like this whole thing is about having a humble attitude toward other people and recognizing the value of every person just like God does.
Right.
But verses 8 and 9 seem to really turn inward.
Right.
Hey, if you have any sin, if you have anything that's causing you to sin, you cut it off. Just like you don't want to be a stumbling block to somebody, whatever is a stumbling block in your life, you cut it off. This is very reminiscent language to what he said in the Sermon on the Mount, about specifically about sexual temptation. If your right hand causes you sin, cut it off. Your eye, cut it off, cast it from you, all that kind of stuff. So I'm not really sure. I've thought a couple things about the placement here. I guess one option is that Jesus is like, hey, speaking of stumbling blocks and speaking of sin, this isn't just about you and other people. You need to watch out for yourself too. I think that's one option as far as why it's placed right here, and maybe even to elevate the importance of it. But I also wonder if there's another thing here that I'm not even sure which direction it goes, and maybe it backwashes in both directions. But whenever I'm giving into sin on a personal level, a private sin, you might think about, even to use the Matthew 5 illustration, like lust or something. It's going to cultivate, really, I'm being prideful because I'm saying, hey, God, I know what you want me to do, but I don't really care. I'm going to do it anyways. I'm not having a childlike spirit. And that's going to cause me to damage other people by the sin that I'm committing for myself. But also, when I don't learn to have a childlike spirit, even in the way I treat and interact with other people, that oftentimes is going to lead me to cultivating a spirit of pride, which is going to lead me into sins that are going to really destroy me too. So I'm not really sure which direction it goes, but I do know there's this really tight integration between the way I view my position before God, the way I view my relationship to other people, and my own personal conduct in sin. And one of the keys to fixing that whole situation is whatever I'm doing in my secret sins, whether it's gossip or lust or greed or fill in the blank, whatever thing is, I need to cut that off and cast it from me so that I don't continue in sin, so that I'll have the right posture before God, so that I'll treat others the way that God wants, and think about others in the right way, like God wants me to.
Yeah, good point. What Jesus is teaching his disciples, apostles who are going to be leading others later, is the same thing that we'll read later in the New Testament when Paul would write to guys like Timothy. And he'd be like, Timothy, you're a teacher, you're a preacher, you're trying to help people flee youthful lusts. But then he would say, like in 1 Timothy 4:16, pay close attention to yourself
Yep.
and to your teaching. Persevere in these things, for as you do this, you will ensure salvation both for yourself and for those who hear you. Look, if the premise of this whole thing is souls matter to God, the first thing Jesus is saying is yours does.
Yeah.
Your soul matters to God. So whatever it takes to make sure that you don't stumble, don't stumble. But then equally, don't make anybody else stumble. Like their souls matter too. What do you think about verse 10? Verse 10, seems to be kind of like Jesus shaking them up a little bit. And I'm curious what you think about when he says, hey, don't despise one of these little ones, for I'm telling you, or I say to you, their angels in heaven continually see the face of my Father who's in heaven. What's that?
I think that's one of those verses you were talking earlier. This has like fuzzy and scary stuff. I think this is one that usually gets read as a fuzzy thing. Oh man, the angels are watching over us. But actually, I think it's meant to be scary. He's
Yeah.
like, hey, do you guys remember what angels did to people? Like, angels will mess you up. I mean, ask the Assyrian army, okay? Do not mess with my people, because I've got their angels are watching over them, and they see the face of my Father who is in heaven. So you don't want the angels going back and reporting to the Father and then getting sent out to do his bidding, because it is not a good thing throughout Scripture when angels get sent out when people are getting mistreated. So that's the way, I read it as a threat, honestly, from Jesus. Like, don't mess with my people or else their angels are going to get you.
Yeah. And angels were also messengers. So if the idea is that God uses spiritual beings to report and to
Mhm.
deal with sort of like, I don't know what all this means.
Yeah.
I know the Jews had certain traditions and ideas about some of this. Um, But if literally, like here we are down on earth and there's somebody wandering around our congregation that feels alone and not thought of and despised and looked down on, and they're struggling and they need God's help, but all of those spiritual people around them, all they're thinking about is themselves. Does anybody care about them? Yeah. Their angels always appear before the face of my Father. And what are they going to be reporting? Hey, God, hey, Father, like this person's not being taken care of by your people,
Yeah.
by your appointed shepherds down there, by those that are supposed to be caring about your kingdom. They don't care about this person. And like you said, later on in the book of Revelation, when we see Jesus as the king who takes his throne, he uses the angels to go out and punish the world for mistreating his people. Like that's a scary deal.
Yeah.
I know this is a verse people want to talk about, like guardian angels and stuff like that. I don't know about that. I know, when Peter was in prison in the book of Acts, I think, is it chapter 8 or whatever? Or no, chapter 12, Acts chapter 12. And all the people are praying, and he comes and knocks on the door because the angel, he got let out. And the girl runs back in and says, "It's Peter." And they're like, "No, it's just his angel." Is that what this is? Like the angel of Peter? Not, I don't think that they meant like his departed spirit. I think they meant like the one looking out for him. I don't know if he's here to bear bad news or what, but this is a curious text. It just is. Like I've always wondered about this.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and it's also an interesting one right before verses 12. You kind of alluded to this earlier. Jesus first says, hey, this is really important that you guys get your attitude right before the Father and get your relationships right, get sin out of your life so that you're living right. And number one, because the angels who are in heaven see the face of my Father. But also, I'm telling you, you need to get this right because I vow it isn't just that there are angels reporting on you.
Right.
I'm here, man. I came. This is why I'm here, is to show you humility. I think somebody referenced Philippians 2 earlier as kind of a parallel text to this. Maybe Pete, I think, maybe popped it up there. Or at least I thought I saw that. I mean, Jesus is saying, I'm demonstrating. I'm the Son of the Father, and I came down here and humbled myself to teach you humility. And now I'm calling you to follow me, to take up my yoke, to take up my cross, and have this same kind of spirit. And I'm telling you that I'm doing this because I care so desperately about each and every one of you that even if just one of you wanders away, I'm trying to chase you down. I'm going to leave the 99 to go after the one. That's the kind of love and humility I have. And we need to embody that too. And that's the really maybe the most convicting part to me about this is how far Jesus was willing to go for me and for all of us. How far am I willing to go to be like him and to treat others and view others like he would? And how serious am I about overcoming and purging sin out of my life? If he was this serious about coming to get me, how serious am I about letting him get me?
Yeah.
It's a really encouraging, but also really convicting and thought-provoking image, I think.
Yeah. Very good. Very good. A lot of good stuff in there, man. I mean, again, the premise of this whole thing is God cares about souls. He cares about yours. He cares about mine. He cares about everybody around us. And those of us that are really going to get this right in the kingdom, we're going to take that seriously, and we're going to be careful with each other. I'm afraid, man, like that some of the things that have gone on in places this last year with, people struggling and going through hard things and lots of attitudes that are thrown around with politics and all kinds of stuff. I'm really afraid that there's been stumbling blocks that have come, and Jesus just warns we've got to get this figured out. We do. And continue to seek the lost like he wants us to. So.
Amen. No doubt. No doubt. Thanks, everybody. That was great. Really encouraging as always. Thanks for all the comments. I like going back and reading them afterwards and trying to keep up as we go, but it's impossible, which is
for some reason, no comments came up on my phone. Like I didn't see anybody's comments.
Oh, really? Okay. Well, there were like
That's
tons
why I
today.
wasn't referencing any of them, because I can't see any of them.
Yeah, there were tons. I couldn't keep up, and I'm sorry about that, guys. We try to, but it's great stuff. That's the best thing, honestly, when we can't keep up and there's too many. It's really encouraging and fun.
Yeah. And I'll have to do this next Monday. I have a lot going on this week. And so we'll see everybody next Monday.
All right. See you guys. Thanks.